Good morning. It's 10:30 this morning in Kansas City. So good morning to you. This is also the opening day for baseball, and the Royals are going to play baseball this afternoon at 1:30. So it's quite a day here. But I want to start off by talking about the ethical church. I know that may sound like an oxymoron to a lot of people who have been disenchanted by the church over the years because of one thing or another that's happened, and they just think church congregations are irresponsible, they're mean-spirited, they're hard to get along with, they don't welcome people, and on and on and on. You've heard them all, and so you know what I'm talking about. But let's see what we can do to better understand how we can create an environment in the church that is ethical, that is kind, that is gentle to others, that is fair. Let's start here with you describing yourself. Which of these blanks would you check? Are you always ethical, mostly, somewhat, seldom, never? Give you a chance to think about that. I know you probably don't want to be too proud of yourself. And what the truth is, the majority of people place themselves in the first or second category. The first or second category, that is always faithful, always ethical, or mostly ethical. Most of us try to be ethical most of the time, at least we think we do. Sometimes, though, we fool ourselves a little bit. we uh, we need to uh, pay more attention to how we treat others and how we do relationships. Remember, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about how we relate to God and to others and to creation. That's what it's all about when we're talking about ethics and moral behavior. Now, most people think that being mostly ethical is fine, unless they're on the losing end of someone else's lapse in ethics, and then they don't think it's so fine, and that's when they're going to proclaim, "You're not very ethical. These people are not ethical." And yet, nobody's sure what that means when they make that statement. I don't know who the Josephson Institute of Ethics is. I have to confess that, but I found this statement that I like, and it is that ethics is about how we meet the challenge of doing the right thing when that will cost more than we want to pay. Usually when we do the wrong thing, it's because we don't want the cost of what it is to do. Now, what causes us to compromise our personal ethical code? Because we all do it all the time, sometimes in big ways and sometimes in small ways. Uh, John Maxwell, a former Baptist preacher who turned into a seminar leader, wrote a book called Ethics 101, What Every Leader Needs to Know. And he said there are the 5 Ps. These are the 5 things that cause us to compromise our personal ethical code. And he's talking especially about leaders in any organization. We compromise because we feel the pressure to do things differently. If we were talking about our moral development, you remember stage 3 of moral development was we kind of like to be liked and we want to get along and we want to please our friends, and so we go along with the crowd. That's the kind of pressure that this is that causes us to follow what somebody else wants to do rather than uh, abiding by our own personal ethical code that we've slowly put together throughout our lives. Sometimes we violate our code for pleasure. That is, there's a lot of things that happen in life where people want pleasure so badly they forget their ethics for a while. It's not just sexual behavior, it's all kinds of behaviors where people want to enjoy themselves and they allow themselves to stop thinking about the impact of their behaviors, their choices on other people. People will compromise their personal ethical code for power. They like power, they like to be in charge, and they will do things to other people that are not, well, you and I would not call them Christian. They're not right. They're hurting others. Or they do it out of pride. They just are so proud of themselves that they feel like they don't have to follow any ethical code, that they can always make it up as they go along. We see that especially in political leaders, I think. And finally, Maxwell says we compromise our personal ethical code because we get our priorities all shuffled in a different direction. Suddenly, something becomes more important than doing the right thing, and so we rationalize for ourselves and allow us to compromise our ethics in order with new priorities because there's something we want to achieve, there's something we want to gain, something we want to get out of life. I showed you this once before, Aristotle's golden mean, and I like to refer back to it because Aristotle says if we're flourishing, if we're living a virtuous life, then the virtues that characterize us, and this is not a complete list, but for example, are courage and justice, temperance, prudence. And then Aristotle shows the extremes on either side of that. If we go to excess or deficit, these are the areas in which our virtue fails us. And to be an ethical person in all our relationships means that we are a virtuous person. And so you can see here how we sometimes can lean one direction or the other because of the circumstances we find ourselves in. Now let's talk about the Bible and living together. What do you find in Scripture that tells us how to live together? Because from my perspective, that's what ethics is. It's about living together. Everything that we have as a set of rules and guidelines, as Bernard Goetz said, is what we do, what we agree to do so that we can live with one another, knowing that we aren't going to be killed by one another. Well, how's the golden rule working for you? When I ask my students at the university at the very first day of the course what they would define as their moral authority, and there'll be some that put down the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, is the golden rule an illustration of ethics by virtue or principle or outcome? Well, that may not be a really relevant question. It may not be that important, but we feel virtuous when we try to live by the golden rule. But it sounds kind of like a categorical imperative. It says, I must always do this because it is one of those duties that can never be ignored. Harry Gensler wrote a chapter on the golden rule in his ethics textbook. And he said, here's the way to think of the golden rule as a consistency principle. That is, so we do things the same way time and time and time again. We always treat people the same way. So first, the golden rule says we won't do something to another unless we believe that this act would be all right. Well, we have to believe it's all right, but it doesn't end there. We won't believe that this act would be all right unless we believe that it would be all right for this to be done to us in the same situation. That gets more to the essence of it. But he goes further. We won't believe that it would be all right for this to be done to us in the same situation unless we're willing that this be done to us in the same situation. Not just that it would be all right, but that we're willing to allow it. So, we won't do something to another unless we're willing that this be done to us in the same situation. That's the golden rule. Now, think about the golden rule and love thy neighbor. Gensler gives us three statements. He says, first, know your neighbor as well as you can. Second, imagine yourself in the place of your neighbor as vividly and accurately as you can. And then, act toward your neighbor only in ways in which you're willing to be treated in the same situation. Try to envision yourself being treated by the other the same way that you are treating them in this particular situation. And you begin to empathize to the degree that you know how you don't want to treat the other because you know how you don't want to be treated. Now, we can argue that the golden rule is a good one-sentence summary of all morality, about what morality is all about, but it's no more than that. It won't give you a specific principle that leads to what you ought to do. It won't go down to the situation and say, now in this particular circumstance, how shall I manage this? A literal golden rule, in fact, could lead to absurdities when we have defective desires. If there are things like if our ethical code is failing us and we have priorities or desires that are really not all that ethical, if we allow the golden rule to inform us in that situation, it would be absurd. That maybe doesn't need to be said, but it's a reality that we need to be aware of. And the golden rule doesn't say what specific act to do, but it avoids inconsistencies. That's its primary purpose. It captures the spirit behind morality, the point behind moral rules. The golden rule engages our reasoning instead of giving the answer. We can't always come up with a checklist of answers for every question that we have about our behavior, but we look for principles. We look for guidelines. and the golden rule can serve as a guiding principle. It applies ideals like fairness and concern. That's how the golden rule works for us. Now, this may be going a little too far for your interest, but Gensler says here's some derivative principles from it. The golden rule begins, treat others only as you consent to being treated in the same situation. Now, remember, I'm trying to get you to think about this in the context of congregation, of faith community, especially as you are a leader, maybe not the pastor or a minister in the church, but a leader in some regard. The fact that you're in this course of study at Phillips means that you are regarded by someone as being a leader in some capacity in the church. So treat others only as you consent to being treated in the same situation. Then about self-regard, treat yourself only as you're willing to have others treat themselves in the same situation. You have the same regard for them as you do for yourself. Then it says, treat yourself in the future only as you're willing to have been treated by yourself in the past. He turns it into a universal law. Act only as you're willing for anyone to act in the same situation, regardless of imagined variations of time or person. And this kind of sounds like Kant's categorical imperative, where it says anything that is all right for me to do, I must consent that it's all right for anyone else to do in exactly the same situation. Well, here's some other rules that we like. In fact, some of you have mentioned that you rely on the Ten Commandments as your moral authority. And let me list that, give you that phrase again, your moral authority. That is, to what or to whom do you turn when you have a question about morality, when you're trying to make a moral decision or an ethical decision? What is your authority? Many of my students at the university will say the Ten Commandments is my primary moral authority. Actually, most of them say their parents are, but they're still, young and haven't stepped out on their own yet. But following rules makes life simple. We like to have a set of rules we can look at and check. That's how the categorical imperative works. That's deontology. Deontology says we have a question, an ethical question. We find the appropriate rule, we point at that rule, and we follow the rule. It's that simple. It doesn't take a whole lot of reasoning. It's just we follow that rule. Now think about these rules, though, that we call the Ten Commandments. These rules are not as specific as sometimes we make them out to be. We still have to accommodate these to the circumstance of any situation we're in. Don't have any other gods. Don't make idols. Don't abuse God's name. Now that's one that's been misunderstood over the years. About don't take the Lord's name in vain. What does that mean? It was about swearing oaths. Don't swear an oath. Just let your yes be yes, as Jesus said. Observe the Sabbath, whatever day you choose for that to be. Honor your parents. Don't murder or don't kill. And nobody's settled on the translation of that actually. And most of the translations you can look in will use one word and footnote the other word. Don't commit adultery. We know what that means. Don't steal. Don't lie about your neighbor. Don't lust after what your neighbor has. Now, are those specific enough for you? Someone would ask me, I know, I've heard it. It says don't commit adultery, but that means you don't have sex with somebody if you're married to somebody else or they're married to somebody else. But then what if nobody's married? So they try to find wiggle room and say, how does it fit to the circumstances I'm in? And we can find ourselves going back to Maxwell's list of the 5 P's, the reason we take exception to our own ethical code. It's for pleasure, it's for pride, it's for power, whatever it might be. We make excuses for ourselves. But don't lust after what your neighbor has. So we like to say that this leaves no gray areas. But I'm sure that if you found somebody who didn't want to follow any of these codes, they would have arguments enough that it's very gray and open to interpretation. You will confront that in the church because many people who are in the church and regard themselves as faithful, ethical people manipulate these rules and other rules all the time in order to be able to do the things they want to do. That's what tears churches apart sometimes. If people conform ethical codes, the Ten Commandments for sure, to fit their circumstances and their desires. I wanted you to remember Gert's 10 moral rules. They're very similar. He said these are universal moral rules that everyone everywhere agrees upon. We talked about those earlier, so I won't go through them in detail. But here's another list that I came up of common morality. Common morality is a term for what the values or the code that everybody tends to agree with. These are similar to Gertz. You also see some similarity to the Ten Commandments. I like number 6, nurture the young and dependent. Keep your promises, of course. Do not punish the innocent. Obey the law. Very similar to what Gert wrote, but this was from another source. Or Beecham and Childress identify these as 10 moral character traits. These are the virtues that we would like to identify ourselves. In fact, I believe we could say these are the virtues that we want to see everyone in the faith community demonstrate in their relationships with one another. Take a look at what you see. Non-malevolence, that means don't do harm or evil to another. Honesty, integrity, conscientiousness, trustworthiness. There is a difficult one we'll talk about more a little bit later. Fidelity, keeping your word, gratitude, truthfulness, lovingness, and kindness. And a word that I want to call attention to is integrity. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but that's one of the most important virtues we can have. If people regard us as having integrity, it means they know that what we say is what we mean. They know that who we make ourselves out to be is who we really are. It's about being what we are, everything that we're trying to get others to believe that we are. That's integrity. Another writer, W.D. Ross, a philosopher, said these are the most important and self-evident ethical duties, prima facie duties. The term prima facie in logic means these stand as valid until successfully refuted. And of course, Ross would say these might be successfully refuted in some specific circumstance. But in general, before we go to any particular circumstance, we would agree that these are important ethical duties. Again, fidelity, then reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficent, doing good, self-improvement, I like that, and non-maleficence. You see the similarity going across these different lists from different sources. These are the traits that identify people who want to be regarded as ethical or moral people. I thought it might be interesting to go back and look at the historic list of 7 deadly sins and virtues that's been in the church for forever, more prominent in the Catholic tradition than in the Protestant tradition, certainly, but we're familiar with all these words. We know that everything on the left is a sin. These are the deadly sins or cardinal sins: pride, greed, lust, and so on. And some of these we saw appear on those other lists that I showed you earlier. And then, of course, the opposite, the good, is humility and generosity, chastity, gratitude, temperance, patience, diligence. Probably if we could hold this up to our congregations and say, let's all practice living on this right side of this list. How can we do that? And are we willing to call each other when we violate one of those, when we break those rules? One of the things that we have most difficulty with in the church is holding others accountable to their ethical code, to the moral code that we all say we are committed to. But we're making an assumption that we're all committed to the same code. We're making the assumption, because we all say we are Christians in the church, that we all agree with these various lists that I've shown you here this morning. But not everybody does. There will be others sitting quietly saying, well, I agree with most of that, but I'm not sure all of that is good. This temperance thing, I'm not so sure about that. I like a little gluttony occasionally. I like to overeat. I like to overdrink. I like to engage in a lot of pleasure. So I'm going to moderate on that a little bit. The key is, what are our expectations of one another in the faith community? I thought it'd be good to go to the New Testament too and start with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes is, Eugene Peterson said, this is about being happy people. And so Jesus calls attention to those who are hopeless, grieving, humble, those who are godly, caring, and pure, the peacemakers, the faithful. These are people who get his attention. And he's saying that some of these will inherit the kingdom of God. Others will be honored by the people with whom they live. But these are the traits that he calls attention to in the faith community. More of the Sermon on the Mount, though, is more direct about what not to do. If you go through all the episodes in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, I think this is a good summary. He says, don't be angry, don't lust. The be angry, you remember he starts off with saying, you have heard that we are not to kill, but now it says, don't be angry. Don't lust, don't make pledges, don't retaliate, don't make pledges. That's significant, isn't it? That's when he said, let your yes be yes. You don't have to swear an oath. Don't retaliate. Don't hate your enemy. Love your enemy. Don't be a religious hypocrite. Don't be a pious show-off. And don't judge others. So here's another list that kind of fleshes things out of how we expect ourselves to behave in relationship to one another. And these are relationships, we talk about them as being in the church community, but they work for family, they work for any group that we're a part of. We go back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the course, that doing and being are connected. Our actions say something about who we are, but every time we make a decision or a choice, it's about who we ultimately become. If somebody lies all the time, then they are becoming a liar. They are known as a liar. What we do over and over again shapes who we ultimately become and how we are regarded by others. This is the formation of virtue. We are developing virtues that make it easy for us to live with one another and to accept one another in our lives. But does the average church member or attendee really understand ethics? What do they mean when they say, we're ethical, we're ethical? I worked with a congregation one time, and I was inviting them to endorse the guidelines for congregational conduct that we have available to us in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This particular congregation said, well, we don't need that. We know we're ethical. We know what to do. We know how to treat each other. And I brought it up time and time again with them. And then don't you know, eventually there was a crisis. There was someone who really mistreated another person, and the church started getting divided over how the church ought to respond to that. And the kindness went out the window, the even-temperedness went out the window. They were fighting against with one another, and there was risk of splitting the church. A number of families did leave over it. And it's because they said, we know what's ethical, we know how to behave, and they demonstrated that they really did not. I gave you a copy of those guidelines for congregational conduct. They're on the web page if you haven't seen them yet. But there's several categories, 7 categories, in fact, that I'm looking at here. But it starts off about our relationship as members to one another. And I want to read some of these specifically. I certainly won't read all of them. But it begins, we will treat one another with courtesy and kindness. We will endeavor to maintain an attitude of Christian love in all our relationships. If we just put our attention on that, that would be a full-time task, wouldn't it? Next, it says we will welcome the expression of differing viewpoints and will seek to create an atmosphere of trust and confidence that will encourage free discussion. We will seek to keep confidences and will refrain from gossip. We will seek in all we do and say to strengthen character and dignify personality. We will remember that our personal conduct gives evidence of our sincerity and reflects upon the good name of the church, the body of Christ. So it goes on through several categories: our relationship as members to one another, our relationship as members to our church officers and leaders. For example, we will select our officers intentionally and impartially on the basis of their commitment, competence, compassion, and maturity in the faith. We will endeavor to distribute our offices among many persons and be appreciative of the services of every member. We will expect our officers to manifest Christian principles in their conduct, and so on. The next category is our relationship as members to our ministers. And, for example, we will respect the time and talents of members of the minister's family. We'll have no greater expectations of them than any other people. There's a long list here of our relationship as members to our ministers. It's just about treating fairly your minister so that the minister is able to do her job. The next category is called our relationship as members to our community and or country. Then our relationship as members to the churches in our community. Our relationship as members to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, or you can, if you're of a different denomination, you could certainly put that in there, and these certainly would be usable in any denomination, in any congregation. Our relationship as members to the Church Universal. It says, we are bound to God and one another through covenant, and through baptism we are made one with the whole people of God. It's a resistance to allow denominationalism to become tribalism, where we like ourselves as if we're disciples, but if you're a Presbyterian or a Baptist, we're not so sure about you. It emphasizes that we really do know we are all one. And the final category, that was the final category, all right. Oh no, our relationship to members of the Church Universal, that's right. So as you can see, it's pretty comprehensive and it's a good guideline. The reason we disciples invite our congregations to subscribe to this through a vote of the congregation and then sign it for themselves is so that they will understand what it means to live as an ethical group of people sharing life together. It means they've taken time to stop and think about it and to study it and to discuss it, not just to assume we're ethical, we know what we're doing, we don't need to worry about any of that. Also, with this document on our disciples website, and anyone can access that, of course, is a study course for how to teach this to the congregation if you want to use it through Sunday school or special study groups or even as part of the preaching on Sunday morning. There's a way to incorporate this list into those teaching opportunities. Well, remember I said what kinds of things cause us to compromise our personal ethical code. Pressure, pleasure, power, pride, and priorities, the 5 Ps. I hope you can remember those as you go along. Now, thinking about the reading you've been doing this week on utilitarianism, I wanted to begin by asking, are Christians utilitarian? Is that an assumption that we make? Because it means we always favor the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Are we in favor of that? Here we are embroiled again in the healthcare debate, wanting to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, maybe finding something else to do, disenfranchising people from their insurance coverage for health care. It's a situation we get into so often, if I may observe, where it's so easy to allow the poor and the disadvantaged to become poorer and more disadvantaged because we don't like spending money to help raise them up to another level. Income tax tables, equal opportunity. In all of these situations, the people with power tend to make the rules. If we're utilitarian, our emphasis is on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, you'll remember reading, I think, that that does not mean that everybody gets everything equally. But it means if, as we are distributing our resources and our opportunity, can we take into account as many people as will be affected by whatever policy that we are making? So where does the church come down on this? Are Christians utilitarian? Do we hold ourselves up as favoring utilitarian public policy? This is where our Christian ethics has to carry into the public forum. When we are making policies and laws that affect everybody, we need to allow our influence to be felt. Now, when have you intentionally ignored a rule or a principle or a guideline or a commandment because you didn't want the likely outcome? That's what we do. We ignore it because we don't want to go where it's going to take us. And that is one of the things that we see when we're talking about consequentialism. We're trying to select an answer that gives an outcome that we want. Now, in the textbook, Lovin talked about act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. I think probably rules utilitarianism is awfully similar to deontology myself. I've always favored act utilitarianism myself. It seems most accessible, especially as we're working together as a group of people. But Aristotle held that the virtuous person will do these things, and I think we can apply this to the utilitarian mindset, certainly about the ethics of the church, about the faith community. He said, if you're a virtuous person, you will do the appropriate thing. You will do so habitually. It'll be a part of who you are. And you will enjoy acting virtuously. You will know that it is virtuous, and you will know why it is virtuous. Go back to this list sometime and think about it some more. A truly virtuous person will understand all 5 of those things with any action that they take. I go back to Niebuhr's 2 questions. Anytime we have a moral decision or an ethical question, what's going on? And then what's the appropriate response? That makes it very simple. A church I've worked with also decided they wanted to talk about being a healthy congregation. And so they set up study groups, and some of the preaching is around this. And they came up, the elders came up with this statement of goals for themselves, and they're going to work on these for a season, and then they're going to come up with some more to work on. But I like the list that they came up with, because these came out of crisis in the church, of when people were not being treated well, when things weren't going well. And so they said, here's some things we need to remind ourselves of. You look at this list and you can see that it's a good list for a group of people in church to talk about. These are the things we tend to forget about sometimes. They just kind of leave our consciousness. So I wanted to share this list with you because it's one that just a group and a congregation came up with and said, let's all take time to talk about these things and make some commitment to them. The main issue is, how shall we manage to live together in a community of faith? You know, Gert talked about the moral rules, or how we've chosen to live together in community anywhere, but a community of faith still has a greater commitment to one another by virtue of our shared faith and our shared baptism. So, shall we manage our lives together by rules, or by something more intrinsic to our sense of shared life? If you always worrying about who's following the rules, you're checking up on each other. Barbara Blodgett would call that an audit culture. We're always kind of checking on people to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. And Barbara Blodgett, and by the way, here's the book. I've talked about it before. It's called Lives Entrusted. I've placed on the webpage my notes that I've taken as I went through this, notes I used to teach from, about 15 pages of notes. I hope they're clear enough that you can understand what she's saying. I didn't want to ask you to read another book, but I thought you'd like to get a sense of what she writes about. Because she says, trust. The main thing we need for the church community to succeed is to have a culture of trust among ourselves in all things. So her book is Lives Entrusted. You can see my notes from the book on the new attachment on the web page. And it's a good book, I think, perhaps one of the best on congregational ethics, and also about pastoral ethics. There's things in here about the pastor as well as the congregation.